If someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be standing in my own front yard, crumpling up wedding invitations while tears stung my eyes, I would have called them out of their mind. But there I was, confetti strewn across the lawn like broken promises, watching as my daughter Stephanie tried to salvage the most important day of her life. The day was supposed to be filled with family, music, and joy. Instead, it was shaping up to be a heartbreak set in motion by one man, our HOA president, James Jim Kildare. Stephanie's fiancé, Aaron, is a wonderful young man, kind, warm-hearted, a dream match for my daughter. They got engaged on a crisp October day, and Stephanie rushed to our house that evening with a radiant grin, declaring she wanted to hold the ceremony in the courtyard behind our home. It was a sentimental choice. My husband, Chuck, and I had renewed our vows there on our 25th anniversary. My daughter wanted that same blessing of family tradition to start her life with Aaron. Everyone in our small neighborhood was thrilled. Stephanie had grown up here, after all. Neighbors offered to help decorate. They said they'd bring lawn chairs, potluck dishes, string lights. You'd think it would be straightforward, a simple backyard ceremony for a local girl. Then in marched Jim Kildare, with the arrogance of a small-town dictator. He wasn't always the HOA president. He got elected a few years back by a scant margin, mostly because people were too busy to show up and vote. Since then, it was as if the title had gone to his head. We'd all encountered the classic battles of petty letters about lawns being too long or shrubs not matching the architectural style. But never had he tried to meddle with something as personal as a wedding. Until now. It started with small jabs disguised as concerned inquiries. Jim knocked on my door one evening, sporting that pressed polo shirt with the HOA logo stitched on the chest. He asked about the approximate guest list, because any large gatherings could become a nuisance. I told him, lightly, that we anticipated around 100 friends and family members, plus a handful of service people, caterers, a DJ, maybe a wedding planner. He just pursed his lips, jotted something on his clipboard, and said something about needing to see a plan in writing to ensure no violation of the neighborhood's covenants. The conversation ended politely, but with an undercurrent of tension that made my scalp prickle. Over the next few days, we started receiving official-looking letters from the HOA. Most contained a laundry list of conditions, permissible noise levels, hours of any music or celebration, parking restrictions, trash disposal instructions. Each letter was more invasive than the last. We complied with everything. Chuck spent hours calling a shuttle service so the guests wouldn't clutter up the neighborhood with parked cars. We agreed to stop the music at 9 o'clock sharp, even though that felt a bit early for a celebration that our family had looked forward to for over a year. Stephanie, bless her heart, tried to keep a bright attitude. She told me, "Mom, maybe Jim's just worried we'll make a scene. We'll show him we have it handled, and everything will be fine." But I saw how she was losing that joyful spark, overshadowed by the constant barrage of demands. Things came to a head one afternoon when Stephanie was busy setting up floral decorations in the backyard. Jim let himself in through our side gate. No knock, no polite greeting, just waltzed right through. He insisted on measuring our yard to confirm that the number of guests matches the square footage allowed for a permitted event. Stephanie was so startled she dropped her floral wire, cutting her palm. Jim barely glanced at her bleeding hand. Instead, he started muttering about potential safety hazards. I nearly blew a fuse. I stormed over, telling Jim we'd had enough. He responded in a curt tone, "I have the authority to revoke your event if it violates neighborhood guidelines." Then he left with a parting shot about how we were on thin ice. That was the first time I realized the gravity of the situation. We might actually lose the venue for my daughter's wedding, which was less than 3 weeks away. Chuck tried to mediate. He called Jim, left voicemails, and wrote polite emails explaining we'd stick to every guideline. Jim ignored most of them or responded with more petty stipulations. Our panic grew as the day approached. Eventually, we requested a meeting with the HOA board to straighten everything out once and for all. It would be in the local community center's meeting room, a place typically used for pancake breakfasts and rummage sales. But that night, the atmosphere felt like a courtroom. Jim walked in confidently with a stack of papers. The other board members, some of whom we knew socially, took seats, flipping through Jim's notes. He began a long-winded speech about how we were requesting an exceptionally large private function, which had the potential for undue disturbance. One of the board members tried to interject, "But this is just a wedding, right?" Jim cut him off, rattling off references to obscure regulations no one had ever heard of. The board looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Chuck and I stood there, feeling like we'd stepped into a bizarre reality. Then Jim dropped the bombshell. Given the magnitude of the requests and the late hour of these negotiations, the Homeowners Association regrets to inform you that the event permit is denied. My heart pounded. Stephanie stifled a sob as she gripped Aaron's hand. That was it. The wedding was canceled. At least, the wedding we'd planned so lovingly in our backyard. Jim had turned our family's dream into a bureaucratic nightmare, and we didn't know what on earth to do next. Word traveled quickly. One day after the HOA meeting, neighbors began showing up at our door to offer condolences and express their outrage. Some even offered to let Stephanie and Aaron use their backyards instead, but each yard was smaller than ours, and it would only be a matter of time before Jim showed up with his long list of regulations to squash that idea as well. We realized that having the wedding anywhere in the neighborhood was effectively impossible under Jim's thumb. My friend and next-door neighbor, Gloria, suggested we complain to the local press. "Shame him publicly," she said. "He can't bully people if everyone knows what he's up to." But the truth was, the local paper rarely covered anything more scandalous than the new library hours or which family had the best Christmas light display. I doubted they'd devote space to our woes, no matter how unjust they felt to us. Stephanie was in tears every morning, not sure what to say to relatives who had booked flights or taken time off work. We tried to look for alternative venues, a downtown hotel, maybe, but it was all so last minute, and the costs skyrocketed. The stress weighed on everyone. I was losing sleep, waking up at odd hours to recheck the budget. Chuck constantly had that worried crease across his forehead. Our sweet daughter's wedding day, the one she had dreamed about since she was old enough to cradle a Barbie doll in a white dress, was crumbling before our eyes. Finally, I forced myself to think outside the box. Jim couldn't be the end of the line, right? There had to be some recourse. I pored over the HOA bylaws and old dusty binders we kept in a closet. That's when I stumbled upon a tiny clause mentioning that if any resident believed the HOA president was abusing power or discriminating, they could petition for a formal arbitration. Sure, it sounded archaic, but it was something. I pitched the idea to Chuck, whose face lit up. "We can show them this isn't just about a wedding," he said. "It's about Jim playing tyrant." Yet, part of me was afraid. HOA lawsuits can be notoriously messy. The board usually sides with their president. After all, they voted him in. But I kept replaying the sight of Stephanie's tear-streaked face. I told Chuck, "Let's do it. We'll never forgive ourselves if we don't at least try." We hired a local attorney, Patrice Green. She was younger than I expected, hadn't even hit 40. But her gaze was sharp, and she immediately saw angles we hadn't considered. "He's discriminating against you by applying the regulations in a way that's never been done before," she said. "I bet if we dig deeper, we'll find other families he's picked on and events he's canceled without proper justification." I blinked. "We don't want a witch hunt. We just want Stephanie's wedding to happen." Patrice leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I understand. But to build a strong case, we need evidence that this isn't an isolated incident of him being cautious. We need to show a pattern of arbitrary enforcement." And that's when I realized the fight might be bigger than we thought. Chuck, Aaron, and I started knocking on neighbors' doors. I fully expected half of them to be too intimidated to speak against Jim. I couldn't have been more wrong. The stories that poured forth startled me. The Davenports across the street said Jim fined them for setting up a lemonade stand for their grandkids on a hot summer's day. The Gonzalezes recounted how Jim threatened them with a lawsuit over the color of their new front door, which he claimed was too bold. Some folks told us about times they tried to hold small gatherings only to receive a barrage of letters from Jim with contrived reasons to shut them down. It became apparent that Jim had been on a power trip for a long time, micromanaging trivial details and terrorizing neighbors into silent compliance. But with Stephanie's canceled wedding, it seemed like everyone had reached a collective snapping point. "He's crossed the line," Gloria said. "This isn't just about an annoying grill on the porch or a questionable paint color. This is a life event. He had no business messing with it." Patrice came up with a plan. She would file for an emergency injunction against the HOA, demanding that the board reverse its cancellation. She would also petition for a formal investigation into Jim's conduct. We knew it was a gamble. Even if the injunction succeeded, the hearing might not happen in time for the wedding to be saved. Stephanie had already postponed it once, hoping we'd find a resolution. But deadlines were looming with the caterers, the florist, the bakery. Yet, hope found an ally in an unexpected place, the local news station. A longtime anchor, Marjorie Wells, had heard rumors of our predicament from her sister, who lived in the neighborhood. Marjorie showed up on our doorstep one morning with a cameraman, asking if we'd be willing to share our story. "The community needs to hear about abuses of power," she said. I hesitated, imagining myself stammering into a microphone. But then I pictured Jim strolling into our yard unannounced, canceling a wedding like he was flipping off a light switch. The anger in my gut replaced my nerves, and I nodded. So we went on air and told our side. To my surprise, the story sparked a local uproar. We suddenly had wedding planners calling to offer discounted services at other venues. Churches outside the neighborhood reached out with open arms, saying they'd be honored to host the ceremony for free. It was touching, humbling, and it gave Stephanie a glimmer of something she'd lost: excitement. But as the groundswell of support grew, so did Jim's hostility. He fired back in the local newspaper, painting us as troublemakers trying to undermine community standards. He insisted that he was merely upholding rules. And the HOA board? They were dead silent, except for a lukewarm statement clarifying that they were reviewing the situation. Everything felt like it was hanging in the balance. Stephanie, uncertain whether she'd still get her dream wedding at home, started looking at alternative locations. At the same time, Patrice was gearing up for a legal showdown. Each day that passed ratcheted up the tension. Our yard stayed half-decorated, a heartbreaking reminder that the date was still approaching. While we waited for the court's response to the injunction, I found myself pacing the house late at night, recalling every memory Stephanie had ever made in that backyard. Her first steps, her 6th birthday party, the poolside sleepovers in middle school. We'd always planned that one day she'd walk down an aisle of white roses right there under the oak tree. Now, that dream was overshadowed by a man's obsession with enforcing power. Little did I know, we were about to get a ruling that would set off a chain of events none of us could have predicted. By the time it was all over, Jim wouldn't just face an injunction. He'd lose far more than his precious presidency. When the judge granted the emergency injunction against the HOA, it felt like a door cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of light. The ruling stated that the HOA board had acted outside the reasonable scope of their authority in denying our backyard wedding without a full membership vote. In practical terms, it meant that the cancellation was put on hold, giving us the chance to proceed as planned, if we dared. But Jim wasn't about to slink away quietly. He filed an immediate appeal, claiming the judge's decision undermined the collective will of the community. He also peppered us with new demands in the days leading up to the wedding. One letter claimed we needed to buy additional insurance for any potential damage to common spaces. Another insisted we hire security to ensure guests wouldn't trespass on neighbors' lawns. It was exhausting, like fighting a hydra. Cut off one head, and 2 more grew in its place. We were still forging ahead. The courtyard was being decorated in pastel drapery and lanterns. Stephanie's dress hung in the upstairs bedroom, waiting for the day she'd finally slip it on. Each time she looked at it, tears of both excitement and lingering anxiety welled in her eyes. Chuck was spending his evenings building a small wooden arch under which Stephanie and Aaron would exchange vows. He carved their initials into the top beam, with a tiny heart around them, an old-fashioned, tender gesture that left me teary. Around us, the community was sharply divided. Some neighbors were outraged at Jim, rallying around us with moral and logistical support. Others feared repercussions, afraid that siding with us would make them targets of Jim's petty vendettas. I tried to understand their caution. A few times, I saw neighbors scuttling inside when they spotted Jim patrolling the streets, clipboard in hand. Then, just 3 days before the wedding date, Jim played his biggest card yet. He claimed that the HOA's communal insurance policy would be invalidated if any injuries or property damage occurred, leaving each homeowner personally liable. If you let this wedding happen, you might all be on the hook for thousands, maybe millions of dollars, he warned in an email blast. It was fear-mongering at its finest, and it worked for some people. Within hours, we received calls from residents pleading with us to move the wedding elsewhere, worried about what might happen. Stephanie and Aaron, stressed to their limits, asked if we should just relocate to one of the churches that offered space. But Chuck and I stood firm. The injunction stands. Legally, we have every right to do this. And that's what we should do, Chuck said. He was determined not to let Jim turn our daughter's once-in-a-lifetime day into a cautionary tale. Stephanie, tears in her eyes, agreed. The morning of the wedding dawned sunny and mild, a stroke of luck considering the day before had brought drizzle. I remember sipping coffee in the kitchen, glancing out at the yard. Chairs lined up, flowers arranged in elegant clusters, the wooden arch gleaming in the early light. For a moment, I forgot all about Jim. I simply relished that this day at last had arrived. Then the guests began to arrive. Our families, close friends, childhood acquaintances. They whispered about the tension with the HOA, but tried to keep the atmosphere celebratory. Everyone cheered when Stephanie emerged in her dress, a soft ivory gown with lace sleeves that made her look every bit the angel I'd always known her to be. Aaron's grin stretched ear to ear when he saw her, and they gazed at each other like no one else in the world mattered. The music started, gentle and comforting. Moments before the ceremony began, Jim strode into our yard. He wore a scowl that twisted his features and carried a folder bulging with papers. Our attorney, Patrice, was on site, having insisted she be there to monitor events. She intercepted Jim before he could approach the front row of chairs. "I have a cease and desist order," he barked. "This wedding is over." He waved a document in the air, trying to catch the officiant's attention. Patrice calmly took the document, glanced over it, and shook her head. "This is illegitimate, Mr. Kildare. A judge already granted an injunction in favor of the wedding proceeding." Jim turned scarlet. "You realize the liability you're all risking?" He spun around to address the guests, who were now staring at him. "I'm protecting all of you from the legal fallout." Stephanie's eyes brimmed with tears. The officiant gently guided her aside, out of Jim's line of fire. I felt my temper flare, and I stepped up beside Patrice. In a voice louder than I intended, I said, "Jim, you've done enough. We have every legal right to be here today. If you continue to interfere, I'll personally see to it that you're held in contempt of court for violating the injunction." My voice shook with emotion, but I stood my ground. A hush fell. Jim's face twitched, but he seemed momentarily unsure. Then, as if his entire sense of power teetered on this moment, he pointed a trembling finger at me and spat out, "You'll regret this. Mark my words." With that, he turned on his heel and marched back toward the street. For a second, no one moved. Then the officiant cleared his throat and invited everyone to take their seats. The wedding music restarted. Despite the tension, Stephanie and Aaron's ceremony was beautiful. I watched them exchange vows with shining eyes, my heart bursting with pride and relief. Neighbors who had been uncertain applauded and cried along with us, sharing in this small but meaningful victory. After the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, they sealed it with a kiss under that handmade arch. A wave of euphoria rippled through our yard. We had done it. Jim had failed to ruin the day that mattered most. But I couldn't quite let my guard down yet. In the back of my mind, I kept replaying Jim's threat. "You'll regret this." I suspected he had one more trick up his sleeve. And sure enough, our lawyer told us that evening, as everyone sipped champagne, that Jim was proceeding with a lawsuit against us personally for breach of HOA contract and damages. A petty measure, maybe but it made my stomach coil. So while we toasted to love and family, Chuck and I exchanged worried glances over our glasses. We had won the battle, but the war with Jim Kildare was far from over. A month later, our lives were consumed by legal machinations. Jim doubled down on his lawsuit, accusing us of everything from property damage to emotional distress. He claimed he endured watching people disregard the HOA rules. Not only was it absurd on its face, but also pushed the rest of the neighborhood to a tipping point. People who had once quietly tolerated Jim's tyranny now flooded the board with complaints. The board itself began to splinter. Some members resigned. Others publicly voiced their regret in ever supporting Jim. Our lawyer, Patrice, filed a counterclaim on our behalf, stating Jim had engaged in harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and abuse of HOA funds for personal vendettas. She had found receipts showing that Jim had spent a portion of the HOA budget on legal consultations specifically to target households he deemed problematic. As news of these revelations spread, tongues wagged, and more neighbors came forward with accusations. It was turning into a full-blown scandal. Then came the day in court. The lawsuit was more than just Jim versus my family. It was effectively Jim versus an entire neighborhood's pent-up frustration. The small courtroom bustled with onlookers, including local reporters who had caught wind of the story. Jim walked in wearing a crisp suit and the most sanctimonious expression I'd ever seen. He carried stacks of documents, presumably evidence of our wrongdoing. We sat at the defense table, flanked by Patrice. My stomach was a tight knot, but I reminded myself we had truth on our side. Jim's attorney tried to paint us as reckless, claiming we'd thrown a massive wedding that violated dozens of regulations. But under questioning, Jim couldn't point to any actual damage or noise complaints filed after the wedding. Patrice then introduced evidence that Jim had never required any other homeowner, hosting smaller or even comparable gatherings, to produce such extensive paperwork. She methodically documented how Jim had singled us out from the beginning, imposing burdensome requirements that weren't consistent with the HOA's guidelines. By the time she finished, I almost felt sorry for Jim. Almost. He looked cornered, sweat beading at his temples. But the most damning blow came when Patrice called forward 3 former HOA board members who had recently resigned. They testified how Jim had manipulated the rules to quash events he personally disapproved of while letting others slide. One of them even admitted Jim had threatened her, saying that if she didn't vote his way, he would leak information about her late HOA dues to the rest of the neighborhood. Gasps filled the courtroom. Jim's face turned a blotchy red. His lawyer desperately tried to regain control, but the damage was done. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s with keen eyes, appeared disgusted by Jim's blatant misconduct. She dismissed Jim's claims against us as unfounded and frivolous. Then she turned her attention to our counterclaim. With a crisp nod, she ruled in our favor, finding Jim personally liable for harassment and misuse of HOA resources. She didn't mince words, stating Jim's behavior demonstrated a remarkable abuse of power for personal satisfaction. Her ruling carried a hefty financial penalty. Jim was ordered to pay damages not only to us but to the HOA's reserve fund, which he had been misusing. Patrice later explained that this sum could reach well into the 6 figures once attorney fees and related costs were tallied. To top it off, Jim was summarily stripped of his position as HOA president. The judge recommended a thorough audit of the HOA's operations, a move that effectively blacklisted Jim from any further involvement in community governance. For a man whose entire identity seemed built around being an HOA president, the outcome was catastrophic. Word circulated that Jim's wife left him amid the scandal, unable to bear the community's hostility and the financial strain. He put his house on the market shortly after the court's decision, presumably to cover the legal costs. We heard rumors that he ended up moving in with a distant relative out of state, his tail between his legs. The day the official ruling was announced, Stephanie and Aaron joined Chuck and me in our living room. We toasted with sparkling cider, Stephanie's request. She'd grown fond of it during her wedding celebrations. The mood was jubilant, but also reflective. "It's over," Stephanie said softly, clinking her glass against Aaron's. He tried to take away our wedding, but we beat him. And now he's the one who lost everything. Despite our relief, the experience left a deeper mark on me than I realized at first. I learned just how fragile a sense of safety and community can be when placed in the hands of the wrong person. It reminded me that bullies often hide behind titles and policies, counting on people's fear or unwillingness to fight back. And it taught me that sometimes you have to stand up, even if it feels uncomfortable or scary, to protect what matters. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. The newly appointed HOA president, a measured woman named Elaine, reached out personally to each household, promising open communication and fair enforcement of rules. Morale lifted, and neighbors felt more connected, having banded together against a common oppressor. As for Stephanie and Aaron, they moved into a cozy starter home just a few miles away. Whenever they visit, they walk by the backyard arch, now a permanent fixture we decided to keep. There's still a faint outline of their initials carved there, a gentle reminder of the day love triumphed over petty tyranny. I sometimes catch myself smiling as I pass that arch memories of the wedding. Stephanie's lace train gliding over the grass, Aaron's nervous grin, the collective sigh of relief when Jim stormed out, wash over me with a bittersweet warmth. When Chuck and I sit out in the yard on quiet evenings, we discuss how proud we are of our family, our neighbors, and ourselves for not letting one person's lust for control overshadow our joy. In the end, Jim's own actions were his undoing. He tried to take everything from my daughter, her chosen wedding spot, her peace of mind, our sense of home, but he ended up losing everything he held dear. Meanwhile, we gained a renewed perspective on resilience, community, and the priceless value of celebrating life's milestones in the place you call home, free from the shadow of a bully. A neighbor asked me recently if I felt sorry for Jim. To tell the truth, there was a time I might have felt a twinge of pity, but not anymore. We fought long and hard for justice, for our family, and for the principle that no one should have such unchecked power. If there's a lesson in it for anyone, it's this: never underestimate the strength of ordinary people standing up for what's right. Because in the face of that collective resolve, even a self-styled tyrant can be toppled, leaving the rest of us free to enjoy the little backyard ceremonies that make life worth living.